Welcome everybody. My name is María Arquero de Alarcón, and I'm a faculty member at the University of Michigan, and I'm co-leading this guest speaker series with my colleague Mona Khafif at UVA. As you all know, at this point in the semester, this is a joint lecture series that we are curating as part of our two seminars. In the case of the University of Michigan, is the Theories and Methods of Urban Design. And I want to say we are really excited to be here tonight with our guests. I'm gonna give Mona the opportunity to introduce herself and her class, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you, Maria. Good evening, everyone, and hello, Jose. We are really excited that you're with us tonight. My name is Mona Khafif. I'm an associate professor at UVA and the director of our urban design programs. As Maria said, this semester we started an exciting collaboration, which basically generated a lecture series with 7 lectures. We are already halfway through the semester. And while working on the larger umbrella topic, we were thinking about what urban design as a larger and more diverse interpretation of the discipline or the bridge discipline can contribute to the increasing urbanization of our planet, basically. We were thinking a lot about what are the niche activities that urban designers or designers can take on, and came very quickly up with a list of ambitious designers, theorists, scholars, and colleagues who occupy niche spaces that are taking on the agenda of the urban, but not necessarily through an assignment that might be provided to them, and also not necessarily through the classic scale of the master plan, for example. So these projects that we are presenting in this lecture series are have something in common. They are all realizations in one form or the other. The question is if the realization and the one-to-one project is in form of a physical project, in form of a digital project, in form of a permanent or a temporary project. We created a kind of set of questions that allow these different projects and very diverse projects to be also compared with each other. And I'm handing it over to Maria to talk us quickly through the guiding questions that all presenters received.
So at this point in the semester, we are all familiar with these 6, points of common discussion, common sharing in between all our guests. We have been asking them to actually share with us how they see their design agency through the projects that they share with us. This is very much about the many roles, the many ways in which we as designers can place our work into the world. From projects that are solving problems, others who are defining problems, from this notion of the project as a way of reading the city and possible ways forward, to other approaches that are more interested in theorization and critical approaches to the urban realm. We are very much interested in actions, in what is the shape that these projects are taking. We have been learning from projects that are provocating, others are anticipating, others are very much about healing, about empowering partners, about very carefully and tactically repairing, and others are all about innovation and testing new approaches. The question about methods, or how important it is, how do we work and how do we conduct our research approaches to also learn from the work that we are developing. And then similarly, how we actually articulate who do we work with, who do we work for, and who do we in a way bring our projects into conversation. This is about partners, this is about stakeholders, this is about larger coalitions, all about pushing beyond the boundaries of the traditional client as the main stakeholder to be able to develop our projects. Last, we have been asking a lot of questions about funding. How are the projects taking place? What are the sources coming from? And what that all means for projects that are very much grounded in building collectivities and new approaches to the commons. And last but not least, there has been a pretty robust conversation about how we talk about replication, about the scaling up the projects, about transferability, what is in between the site-specific to the prototypical, and what are the values and the challenges that each one of the projects present. So these are some of the ways in which we are trying to establish relationships and see how different ways of practicing and theorizing urban work today are in a way helping us to establish relationships. And Mona, we cannot hear you.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, there you go.
That happened. Sorry, Karim has to cut this out of the video. So as I mentioned earlier, we established the whole lecture series, and today we are with Jose Sanchez. There are 2 remaining lectures afterwards. And maybe just as a note, Nada Nafe will be with us on Wednesday and not Thursday next week, calling in from Cairo at an earlier time than the evening slot. I want to hand it over now to our team of students who are moderating the evening. Sarah and Jan are joining us from Michigan, and Kaoming, Xinjuan, and Vina are joining us from UBA. And as in earlier evenings and sessions, students are introducing our speaker and are also prepared a set of questions, and will later on also moderate the questions that are coming from their peers to have an encouraged dialogue and discussion at the end of the presentation. And with this, I'm handing it over to the student moderators. Thank you. And Karim and Ishan, again, thank you so much for taking care of all of the technology that is a part of these presentations.
Okay, hello. Let me make a brief introduction to the Jose Sanchez. Jose Sanchez is an architect, game designer, and theorist based in Detroit, Michigan. He is the director of the Plethora Project, a research studio investing in the future of the propagation of architectural design knowledge. He is the author of the book Architecture for the Commons, Participatory Systems in the Age of Platforms, published by Routledge in 2020, and the co-creator of Bloom, a crowdsourced interactive installation, which was the winner of the Wonder Series hosted by the City of London for the 2012 Olympics. He is currently at the University of Michigan, where he is an associate professor at the Tubman College School of Architecture. He is also the creator of the video games Blockhood and Commonhood, digital social platforms that add the authoring of architectural and ecological thinking to non-expert audiences. So Blockhood is a city building simulator video game that focuses on ideas of ecology, interdependence, and decay. The game invites players to envision the neighborhood by building structures out of a catalog of more than 200 blocks. The game is both an educational and research initiative exploring the connection between games and architecture, contributing to a form of digital infrastructure for the ecological and systems thinking that is necessary in contemporary urbanism. Blockhood also is an award-winning city building simulator. So now please join me in welcoming Jose Sanchez.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I want to start by thanking Mona and Maria for the opportunity to speak with you today. And I certainly want to extend a great thanks to the University of Michigan team that has made an extra effort, especially to Ishan Singh, who is currently has managed to make this fantastic presentation work, and Anya Sirota and Jacob Commercy, who have been really kind of trying to push what University of Michigan is doing in regards to the communication on delivering content beyond the kind of the Zoom backgrounds that we're doing every day. So I'm happy to try this experiment and let's see how that goes, right? So I want to start by sharing my ideas about what I'm been calling platform realism, and perhaps start with this idea of the affordance of realism next. Next slide. I recently moved to the city of Detroit. I'm originally a Chilean architect. And in Detroit, I was able to experience the beautiful murals of Diego Rivera. And next slide. The work of Diego Rivera in many ways resonates very profoundly on my own interest in depicting the human body, simulating systems of labor. Next slide. And then I started kind of connecting my work in many ways to the legacy of Mexican painters such as José Clemente Orozco or David Alfaro Siqueiros. Next slide. And understanding how the legacy of some of these muralists, especially looking at utilizing a medium such as the mural, was also influential for some of the work, for instance, of American artists such as Elizabeth Catlett and many others. Next slide. For me, this kind of work that embraces certain forms of realism was a contingent and very important work that emerged in a particular period of time. And in many ways, I feel like we are living through a period of time that requires a similar approach to kind of bring forward some of the challenges that we're facing. Next slide. Through these perspectives of systemic racism, but also inequality on many levels, I think that there is a reality that should not be not acknowledged. Next slide. As a Chilean architect, I come from a very specific background that it's also under a kind of important crisis. We're actually going through a change of a constitution, a process that has been a series of social uprisings that has called for a change of a constitution with a great degree of approval. And I think that it's an interesting point for the Chilean people to really think what a constitution for the 21st century, how does a 21st century constitution look like? Next slide. So yeah, I am actually someone as a Chilean that is participating on the process, as I think every Chilean is, to consider what does a new constitution looks like. Next slide. And here we can just maybe go quickly through some of these references. I think I want to think, and I work with students to think about how do we think the right to privacy when we look at social media platforms, as has been pointed out by Shoshana Zuboff, or rethinking how do we think about access. Next slide as well. Our right to housing, as some of my students have been reflecting, issues of property, the right of native populations, the exploitation of common resources. And let me maybe just stay in this one. I think that it hasn't been a coincidence, I think, that Chilean groups, for instance, the group Por un Habitar Justo, Por un Habitar Digno, has used the mural, has used this kind of large-scale representation drawings to connect to the public, to really embrace art, but also carry a message, a form of realism that depicts, in this case, is showing the size of some of the social housing that is happening within the current practices in Chile, to really connect and empathize with what is really going on socially. Next slide. So, next slide as well. I just finished a book called The Architecture for the Commons, and I wanted to kind of quickly give you a glimpse again, and this is something we can go relatively quickly, of some of the ideas in the book. The book reflects upon what we consider architectural progress. And I think that for quite some time, I studied in the AA under Patrick Schumacher, and I think that there's an idea of progress, or for at least a group of architects, there's an idea of progress that has been associated with form and the production of more and more challenging forms and have more freedom in form. But in many ways, I think that that project has run its course, and it's certainly not really offering us avenues forward. I spent quite a bit of time really going deeper into a critique of parametrics, if you want, through a chapter that I call The Coalescence of Parts, and understanding how we slowly start losing a sense of or access to participating in the construction process when buildings become more and more coalesced or really are kind of centralized through a process of vertical integration. So in many ways, what I do in the book is a defense of parts, thinking that parts do give us an avenue for a pluralistic multi-actor economy, one in which participants, either through sweat equity and labor, can participate and contribute. I see my own work as in a tectonic level and as an architectural level, as an exploration of a part-to-whole relationships, celebrating parts and their distributed capacities. But also, I consider that digital platforms are an opportunity to recombine, consider the potential of social combinatorics in architecture. Yeah, so I think that I like going this order because Bloom for me was really a point of departure to really connect something like a toy, right? Like next slide shows how a simple unit, a part, could embed certain rules, certain logics, but in a way be thought of something that could grow, right? It had the seeds for something larger. Next slide. It defines a rule system, and this is kind of coming really from my background of programming and understanding generative systems. But in a way, the interesting move of this project, you can see in the next slide, is the moment that we open the system to a social system, right? There's a coupling of logics here, one being a logic of an architect, a designer that wants to kind of create this installation in the world, but also a social system that really adopts and kind of transforms, bends, breaks certain rules to kind of make it relevant and meaningful for a particular instance. Next slide. Another project that I've explored some physical, tectonics is the Foliage project, which, next slide, shows how simple standardized elements, some of the theories that I describe in the book about discrete architecture, talks about how small components, that perhaps inexpensive components that could be serialized, could allow for a large permutation and variability of systems, right? So it's not about just making parts incredibly complex and unique, as the theories of non-standard architecture perhaps led us to believe, but rather kind of thinking of inexpensive parts that have a multiplicity of connections. So we designed a part, as you can see in the next slide, that allows, next slide, and here you can go quickly again through these slides. We kind of serialize the production of these parts that they basically determine how simple standardized pieces of wood are oriented, right? So you can see here that the orientation of wood elements is fundamentally determined by this kind of small joint, a serialized piece of like inexpensive steel joinery. And we have eventually create a tectonic system, a space frame, if you want, that grows out of such a logic, right? So the organization of the material is what leads to a series of possible outcomes. And there's some renders and images that we provided as how can this system adapt and transform. And in many cases, when architecture starts becoming, more, it starts growing in scale, it's difficult to think that this would actually be a game and people would be able to play with these pieces. But I really think of these projects also as a toy. So we actually created a miniature toy version of the project together with a series of instructions that would help anybody to combine and learn what you can do with the system, but also allow for someone playing with the system to expand upon it and perhaps, again, bend or break the rules. Maybe stay in this slide for a second. And we also envision that such digital or the recombination of parts could happen at a much more global scale through the engagement of video games, right? And this is an image of the game Commonhood that I'm going to show at the end of this presentation. But there was already an intuition of trying to connect physical systems and digital systems. How do we allow crowds to iterate and tinker with the possibilities, and in a way add meaning and value to the patterns, the data arrangements that define one configuration from another one, right? I think that there was a contribution of how parts become the building blocks, but the patterns are something that in a way emerge locally and contingently when engaging a social system. So I'm going to move to the next slide. So with that in mind, I hope that this kind of really sets up the stage of what how I got to games. Some people say, hey, Jose, you're working on games and architecture, but the games has been more of an answer to a question of how do we allow certain social systems to interact and participate on a process of form making and the definition of what forms we ought to be making, right? And I describe games as explicit bias, and I'm going to try to unpack that a little bit as we go. So the idea of a platform is something that is central, it has become central as a body of study in my work. As I think that we are living through the age of platforms, people like Nick Chernyshek talk about platform capitalism, Shoshana Zuboff talk about surveillance capitalism. And in many ways, next slide, today, the most powerful entities in the world are associated with this network infrastructure that is capable not only to understand who their users are, but also perhaps, as Shoshana mentions, persuade and alter the behavior of its users. So next slide. In many ways, we've seen examples of how democracy has also been challenged by, in this case, the whistleblower Christopher Wiley revealing the kind of what Cambridge Analytica had been able to do, having access to the Facebook network. And next. And other people like cyberpunks, including people like Julian Assange, have been warning us for this and giving us directions of what are those technologies, perhaps cryptography, and how do we kind of protect privacy? How do we become citizens of a world that has become fundamentally led by digital platforms? Next slide. In many ways, platforms define, if we remember or not, authorship, ownership, right? And many times I see myself running through Pinterest and not necessarily taking enough attention of referencing or kind of citing who are the people that I'm actually being influenced by. And I think that some of that practice really kind of forgets very quickly where value potentially came from. And I think that we ought to be designing better platforms to keep track of that. Next slide. Someone like Ted Nelson has been mentioned by Jaron Lanier in one of his books, has created data structures that try to keep track and create ledgers that maintain the memory of a network, meaning that our networks do not have a memory by default, and that needs to be done by design. We want to design networks that have a different protocol for interaction between users, right? So the process of designing a platform is fundamentally defining what are the protocols of and what are the rules by which we want to be engaging with each other as humans. Next slide. Issues like the Creative Commons license especially has certain attributions that I find very interesting. Things like the share-alike attribution, the idea of allowing remixing, right? How do you take content that has been created by someone else, remix it, combine it in a different way and share it yet again. That process for me is fundamental to really think that there could be a proliferation of value and content being produced by users. Next slide. And then who owns the platform? Who has, I think that people like Trevor Schultz have been leading a conversation about how do we think of platforms not as a surveillance platform or a surveillance technology, but perhaps one for cooperation, right? And I think that puts an emphasis on that the design of the platform fundamentally changes the rules by which the platform operates. Next slide. So these are some of the considerations that make me think, well, if architecture would be designing a platform, would be conceiving of a platform, what would be the challenges, right? And what are potentially some of the solutions or suggestions that people have put forward. Next slide. I think in architecture, we don't have a platform yet. And I think it's going to happen. We have things like, Sketch, the 3D warehouse archives of SketchUp models, or we use Instagram for image collection. Next slide. Or wonderful projects that I admire deeply, like WikiHouse or the Open Building Institute, use GitHub or other kind of platforms that are fundamentally not catered for architecture to really kind of propagate their their material. But I think that it's certainly games, as we can see. Next slide. A medium that is very well equipped for generation of content, for the propagation of content, for the tinkering of content. This is images from The Sims, and which has a very robust kind of set of building tools, very much catered for non-experts and certainly not interested in, fundamentally not interested in architecture. There's kind of a whole different discourse of affordances of this engine. Next slide. So for quite some time, since 2013 or so, I've been researching games and architecture to really reflect upon how games could become a form of social media platform, and under which principles such platforms should be designed. So Blockhood, just to give you a bit of a context for the project, Blockhood is a city building simulator. It sits into a tradition of city building games such as SimCity or City Skylines, and it really tries to reflect of how would these games would be designed if they were not done from the perspective of the economy, but perhaps from an ecological perspective. What this means is that the game doesn't really charge you for producing new tiles, for producing new forms in architecture, but rather challenges the player to keep the designs alive, if you want, right? Like the game really uses the analogy of a beating heart, right? Everything that you create within the game needs to be sustained. Trees will need to be provided water, and commerces are going to be requiring customers in many ways, right? So that every tile creates a dependency to other tiles, right? So as it was mentioned in the introduction, the game has over 200 tiles, and it's really trying to think what are the possible tiles that a city block can actually have, and how those tiles define interdependencies with one another, right? So the first mechanic that the game really plays with is this idea of interdependence, the inputs and outputs that come from one tile to the next. So the player is not really forced or challenged to do anything in particular. It's your own imagination what defines what you want to do with the game. But it's through the addition of any tile in the system that you will realize that tile will require certain dependencies, and that starts motivating and starts escalating into larger and larger constructions, right? So it's a game that many people have described as something very relaxing, that you work at your own pace. There's no kind of a narrative that leads you to work through the game. But at the same time, it starts getting more and more difficult because you have to match your own ambitions, right? Like the more you want to build, the more you have to sustain and you have to figure out. And the idea of Blockhood is to really maintain within the city block all the dependencies that you might have. I think that we've grown used to think that waste management, for instance, is something that you could externalize, or energy production will come from somewhere else. But in Blockhood, you have to take care of all those things within your city block, right? So it really kind of fundamentally closes an idea of an externality, right? So you have to produce your own food, you have to manage your own waste, and you have to manage the consequences of some of your decisions, right? So that could be in the form of pollution, that could be in the form of smelly neighborhood or something like that, right? And you're not just passing that problem to someone else through the virtue of being able to pay for it, right? So that's kind of one of the realizations that the player is invited to have. It's like, what does it mean to really start thinking of taking a profound responsibility for the systems that we are dependent on. So this is a diagram of how the interdependence of resources works within Blockhood, right? We can imagine that every tile is interdependent with each other. Next slide. And how you can actually create a supply chain, right? Meaning that you might have some industrial food production system that requires a dependency between certain concentrated feeding operations, perhaps, or GMO farms. And then next slide, you could actually compare that of what would it be like maybe an organic food production system and the kind of resources that would be moved around that supply chain, perhaps, and the different yields that those could produce. Next slide. The game is fundamentally working under a principle of synergies and proximities, like each tile kind of understands what's happening around it. Next slide. And the player is presented information in a whole series of forms, understanding production data, access data structure, in order to achieve a design. Next slide. Next slide. The result of commonhood, many people always ask me, it's like, is there kind of a way of beating the game? Is there a winning state? And I think that my notion of a game, it's not perhaps under the tradition of winning or losing, but perhaps really designing different patterns, different kind of arrangements that might be meaningful or valuable to a particular context, right? And in this case, we're starting to talk about the player's agency. I'm part of the designer of a team that that is thinking of the game structure, but I'm not the player, and the player has the agency to define its own series of their own value system. And that's very important. It's just not to impose a value system in the production of my software and the games that I produce. There's no value system that is imposed, but there's kind of a multiplicity. It's more of what are the options, that how we can think through the variables, through the options, and certainly in many cases players expand upon those. And I wish that I'm still kind of researching on how to open up further the engine that players can further expand what is possible with these systems. So next few slides, maybe we can move through those. The fundamental objective of the game is really to create an open-ended system, one that can yield a multiplicity of results. And even in these diagrammatic forms, these forms would be the result of players' intentions. Looming on the opposite end of these forms are also the idea of decay, as you know, we're kind of the game mechanic of maintaining a healthy building is central. Maybe stop in this slide for a second. The game has a component that has to do with narrative, and that came much later in the production of the project. And I mention it now because it has really become a central feature or the point of departure of my next project, Commonhood, which I'm going to share with you in a second. And initially I never understood what narrative had to offer, but in many ways I started understanding that the production of computational thinking, which I felt like I've been always part of in the discipline of architecture, has always been operating in a vacuum, has been operating under abstraction. The empty environments of something like Rhino or Maya are not populated with stories or the constraints or the challenges that we see socially. And it is perhaps certain layers of narrative, certain layers of constraints that we see in the real world that have not been bound in the digital yet. So that has been a reflection that I have been carrying towards the development of my next video game, Commonhood, which I want to share with you in a second. But next slide. Just to conclude in the Blockhood project, as much as we have been doing certain workshops and activities in schools and educational initiatives, there's nothing like the online activities that the game can achieve through an online global engagement. And I think that has been the power of video games that I see has to do with their capacity to scale to a global audience and really connect people that might be from widely different ages and different cultures to contribute to a design process that could be for a specific locality. So Blockhood is a project that took me around maybe 3 or so years to develop. I started very much on my own. I'm someone that initially in school I started learning how to program and started doing small simulations, and then Blockhood became my main project, working through this software development challenge, right? But it definitely grew. I want to thank obviously all the team that participated at that project, and it grew to the point of really becoming also a new project, Commonhood, which, if you go to the next slide, has also a large team of people that I'm thankful that are working behind, and I cannot thank you all enough for your contribution in this project. This video is a little bit of a trailer, something that we released recently. The game hasn't been released yet, and it very much has a very different point of departure. As you can see here, the game features a narrative, a main character, Nikki. She's been evicted from her home, and she ends up as a squatter, part of a community of squatters living in an abandoned factory. There's a lot of symbolism on this occupation, and it has to do with the failed dreams of progress that a different generation had. And Nikki represents a new generation that is ought to be thinking about how to kind of rise, how do you create wealth in a neighborhood with a certain, perhaps a different series of ideals, right? So you are invited in the game to build your own tools, build your own, or slowly access different forms of tools, and start thinking of design fundamentally mediated by the lens of scarcity, right? It's, imagine you have a 3D building environment and you don't have infinite lines. You have a limited amount of lines, or in this case, pieces of materials and wood and concrete and metal to work with. And you have to be very purposeful of what you do with those materials. So that's kind of the premise for the game. You are occupying this abandoned factory and you're creating kind of a thriving community within it, always with the threat of being evicted again. You are in many ways occupying illegally this space, and in a way, so the kind of antagonist of the game has to do this kind of the precarity of this occupation, that it's not formally under a legal framework. So this is something that, in a way, it's carried by the narrative of the characters. In many ways, the game wants to reflect upon notions of labor, notions of organization and collectivization of projects, and how do players engage, not through commanding other kind of characters in the game, but rather kind of creating trust within a community. So next slide. The game presents the question, where is architecture conceived? And that takes us a little bit to why are we here? Why are we in this kind of one of the environments within the game? Because I do think that as I mentioned before, the environments in which architecture and computational design have often been non-charged of narratives, not charged of social stories or kind of accountability for certain some of the issues that we see in the world. And I think that starting to bring computation to a domain where it is charged, it is kind of perhaps even in a simulated form, existing within some social struggle, I think that could make a difference. So we can move through the next few slides a bit more quickly. The setting of the game, as I mentioned, has to do with economic inequality, narratives of dispossession, the post-industrial cities, failed projects of progress, who are invited to participate in the table, and what are the tools, what are the kind of the paths from, going from nothing to really slowly constructing a thriving. Can we stop in this slide for a second? How do we get to design? And in many ways, the tagline of the project has been, how do we design mediated by scarcity? Here I reflect upon how access to materials, access to tools, access to knowledge and labor, all of them have impacts, as instead of thinking of the mechanics of what empowers you, commonhood really thinks about what are those mechanics that mediate your creativity. And perhaps not just mediate it to reduce it, but perhaps steer it in different directions. Right? So next slide. I want to believe that the designs and stories that emerge from within the game are fundamentally entangled with social narratives, right? Next two slides. And this is a model that it's not very common for video games. Video games have often put the player into this God position, this God mode. Actually, there's a model or a model for games called the God game, and where the player literally plays as a God to transform the world at its will. And I think in many ways we are developing with Commonhood a critique to such an initiative, where the player is entangled with the simulation. There's a much more of a push and pull relationship with the simulation as opposed to a commanding role on the simulation. Next slide. There's a large tradition. I'm a big fan of board games, and there's a big tradition of games also that have to do with worker placement. And as you can see in the next slide, that is also something that happens. Sorry, I think that we, yeah, no, maybe that one. Worker placement is also a kind of a tradition that has to do with allocating or resources or looking at labor as a form of human resource. I think that the game really wants to go beyond that tradition and starting to think what is the relationships that need to be established in a multi-directional, in a bi-directional way in terms of how a community as a collective really gets organized. Next slide. Can we go to the next slide? Next one as well. Is that the last slide you have? Right. Oh, wow. Okay. So we're not far from my ending, but I had maybe a few more slides. Nothing that I haven't shown already in the video. So maybe you can go back a few slides and we can end on some notes on, yeah, maybe a few back. Yeah, this is good. Yeah, so the game wants to become a social media platform where people can author architectural content, but also share it with others, right? And we're trying to work hard on developing an online platform system where people are credited for the work they produce, they're owners of the work that they produce, and we can contribute to a form of online commons where there could be sharing of content and knowledge, architectural knowledge that could be put at the service of communities worldwide. That means that through the access of a relatively inexpensive video game compared to kind of a professional software, and through the kind of online collaborations, forums, and platforms that are provided within the game infrastructure, there could be a collective discourse emerging. I mean, at least that's what I'm hoping for. Some of the tools that maybe I couldn't show you here have to do with, sharing your own designs in the form of a blueprint, sharing that with others. How do someone else like or appreciate what you have produced, and how do that kind of knowledge grows over time? In many ways, that's my ultimate objective, is really to kind of contribute to or help as a form of infrastructure to grow a repository of solutions that could have a translation into the real world, right? With Blockhood, the first game, there was much more of an attempt to create a diagram of how the city operates and really start reflecting upon ideas of ecology. But with Commonhood, there's certainly more of an attempt to take the work into a more realistic setting, also more accurately depicting proportions, and something that could eventually bridge the gap between the virtual world and the world of architecture. But this time doing it through a collective enterprise, something that could have thousands of players engaging and participating, further democratizing what we do with architecture. I usually like ending on a quote by Donna Haraway, which I really love, especially because it kind of rejects the notion of autopoiesis, which people like Patrick Schumacher and certain people in architecture have used in the past. And she introduces the notion of sympoiesis. And I'm going to quote here. She says, "Sympoiesis is a simple word. It means making with. Nothing makes itself. Nothing is really autopoietic or self-organizing." And I think that those words from Donna Haraway are certainly central to and motivational for the work I do with the development of Blockhood, Commonhood, and future projects. So I want to leave it there. I don't have a concluding slide, but yes, thank you.